But let's come to our headlines, as we always start the show with. And joining us today is our good friend Joseph Kotrie-Monson. Joseph, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Good afternoon,
this is a
Trisha.
good one. Let's have a look at the headlines. Now, Commons Watchdog dismisses MPs' demands for huge hardship payoffs. Now, when the certain parts of the, they had a look at MPs' pays and what have you, they compared it to Germany and thought that our MPs come up with their basic salary of, £86,584. They're entitled to a loss of office if they lose their next round of elections. They get a out of office loss of office payment. Now, it's been said that it's been paid too late and what have you. However, they're not going to get some massive pay rise that they hope for. And it's been suggested that maybe what we should be doing is training our MPs for retirement, as if they don't know what that's all about. What are your thoughts on this?
Maybe we should be giving them courses in the local job centre so that they can learn how to integrate, so they can learn how to use computers, all that kind of stuff. They're all about promoting those types of ideas to us, aren't they? Trisha, I think it's a difficult one, this. MPs' pay will always be a thorny issue, because what's the first argument we get? Look what a hardworking nurse gets, look what a doctor gets, look what a legal aid lawyer gets, for example. I'm not as against the idea of MPs being paid well as someone might think, because I actually think that the quality of the intake of MPs has become a major problem, because it's no longer a career that only the rich can access out of a sense of public duty. Go back 100 years, we had the phenomenon of the gentleman MP. There were no women MPs in those days, of course. And there was a kind of principle of kind of public service, and you didn't need the money. And as a result, you had these highly educated people. We talked about it last time. Both highly educated Labour and Conservative MPs in the early part of the last century, and even Clement Attlee that we talked about. Nowadays, what do we have? Well, we have a kind of professional MP who sometimes is a bit of a letdown. Dare I say, a professional Prime Minister in Liz Truss, who wasn't intellectually up to the job. I think that whether or not you agree with that, there are many people who would agree with that, Trisha. Kwarteng and his unique take on national economics. Well, there are a lot of economics professors who said this is stuff that a second-year undergraduate, these are mistakes that a second-year undergraduate wouldn't make. And of course, the Brexiteers who now populate Parliament, or the hardcore, further to the right, more about national pride than the reality of economics, guys, who you couldn't probably have imagined in Parliament 20 or 30 years ago, because the intellectual substance isn't quite there. So I'm actually an advocate of pay MPs more, attract MPs from the top echelons of business, of law, of medicine.
But Joseph, hang on. What about people like Jack Straw and David Blunkett and all of those people who were union work, had an actual trade, had done a job, had come up through the shop floor, organising, and if you like, working at politics at a very real level, when you're shoulder to shoulder shoveling goal, at a very and really understand people. Is there a danger that we miss out all of those people who are tradespeople, who would actually make very connected parliamentarians? I mean, that's my worry, that we go back to just academia and miss out a lot of talent that has come through apprenticeships and trades.
I think that's right. And I think there has to be a balance. But at the moment, what we're doing is we're probably attracting those idealistic, highly capable people who are at all levels and come from shop floors, etc. And I think that's great. But we're missing out in a meritocracy, that's how we see our kind of social and corporate society. In a meritocracy, we're missing out on people who perhaps will take a pay cut to go into Parliament, but not that much of a pay cut. And I think that's probably a shame. I'm all for public service. I think one of the best things that you can do is apply to represent your local area as a councillor, as a magistrate, even as an MP. But that has to be made a little bit more attractive. And the reality is that we know that if you, and I'm not one of these people who says 80 grand isn't a lot of money.
But you need to be paying them more if you want to get the sort of people that we really need, who know what the hell they're talking about.
That's right. And you'll always...
Sorry, I was going to say, only because of time, let's move on. I despair. And I don't think money is the answer to this. I sometimes despair of some of my fellow journalists, because I looked at this headline, "Don't get political like Gary Lineker, charities warned." And if you go on the headline, you think it's about Gary Lineker. When you actually read it, this is about Charity Commission head Orlando Fraser KC. And when I read where he's coming from and what he means, it's actually, please, let me tell people out there, do not go on headlines, and if you're training as a producer or a journalist and you're looking at stuff, do not go on headlines, because they are so often toilet fodder. This is about how much British people give to charity, and they give out tough economic times. People reached into their pockets, this is British people, to hand over a record £400 million in response to an appeal by the DEC, that's the Disasters Emergency Committee. Now, what I love about Orlando Fraser KC is he actually got off his bum, and this is a really unusual thing for somebody to do. He went to Bulgaria. He went to actually see what sorts of things the money does. And one of the things he criticises, never mind the tiny little sentence where somebody sort of pushes him into mentioning Gary Lineker, he talks about politicians losing sight of what they do. Now, where was the bit? Who was I just? There were some of the quotes that have come out recently, kind of running down refugees and attacking charities who give money to refugees like Ukrainians or what have you.
Yeah, I just think it's tremendously sad that the way that the Telegraph has used what you and I often talk about as these misleading headlines, as if this is about Gary Lineker. Of course, it's not. This is
nothing to do with him.
Fraser KC is the man who's gone out to see these refugees, to see the good work that's being done. Hats off to him, because don't we have this assumption that there's no real connection, this kind of assumption that's often peddled in the tabloid media that money that we donate ends up getting lost in management and charity fat cats, as if there is such a thing. And he's really trying to draw attention to the great work that's being done in this sector at the moment. And he does say, if you can avoid inflammatory rhetoric, sometimes used by politicians, unfortunately, then mentions Gary
Lineker in one tiny sentence.
And that's seized upon. All I can say is the Daily Telegraph doesn't have a great deal of confidence if it's in its own readers, if it thinks it can write a headline like that and then an article that barely mentions Gary Lineker and talks about all other types of good things. It's right, charities must stay out of politics, but he's talking about charities and he's talking about governments. He's talking about Suella Braverman and her kind using phrases like swarms.
Lee Anderson. And Lee Anderson recently, this is the bit I wanted to say. He said refugee charities were, quote, just as bad as people smugglers, quote, because they were encouraging dangerous channel crossings. In recent days, he's talked about people only to donate to small local charities. Mr. Fraser said it can't be really serious as millions of people flee war and persecutions. He says, I would like politicians to think more carefully when they attack a big international aid charity, think about what they're saying and how they might be damaging the good work that these organisations are doing. And that should have been the headline. That should have been the headline.
I mean, let's try and keep Anderson out of your wonderful program as much as we can, Trisha, because, if I have a children's party and I run out of numbers for Rent-A-Bigot, I'm sure he'll be available soon. As far as
actually, I'd love to have him on this show. I've got to say, I'd love to have him on this show.
I don't think it lasts 5 minutes, Trisha, to be honest. Did you see him on that BBC interview a few months ago? I think he rang off that one, and I don't think he'd last much longer under the crucible of the Trisha fire. However, I think there is a legitimate point being made about the line between politics and charities, the idea that the sector should not be seen to be undermined. And the role of the Charity Commissioner is, among other things, to make sure that the sector remains one that is above reproach, one that is seen as trustworthy, and specifically in relation to different causes.
Absolutely. Now, I was going to talk about the PSC union boosting its fighting fund and taking it to £4 million. I think a lot of people wouldn't realise that unions actually can say to their membership, we need more money, because people on strike do actually get a certain amount of payment. For instance, the nurses, it's between 50, they want to raise it to £80 a day. When I read this headline, I thought, well, dog whistle stuff springs to mind. I mean, this has always been the case, hasn't it? That unions have always paid people striking.
And again, we go to the difference between the headline and the article itself, Trisha, because what do they lead on? Passport unions, the passport agency. And then the article is actually all about the BMA and the £50 a day that's going to nurses, etc. But why do they want us to read the headline first to get us angry? Because we're all planning to go on holiday, aren't we?
Yes,
we're all hoping to use our passports. Many of us, myself included, are a little bit worried about renewing that passport, and I've got a few weeks left to go.
Yeah.
And of course, the article itself is actually about their hardship payments. They're for food. They're for basic necessities. It's 50 quid a day. And where does the money come from? It comes from the dues of the same members themselves.
Yes, so they're paying into it. It's not robbing.
Getting them back. Well, why is this a story? I'm taking
exactly. Well, I'll tell you why.
On the money I've put in myself.
Buried in there, well, no, not buried in there, is the fact that there's a loophole that unions don't have to pay tax on this. I mean...
Well, it's a loophole for charity payments, and it's money they've already paid over.
I know, exactly.
Trisha, where's the actual story here? I failed to see it.
I think I'm going to have to go back to working and talking, and I did used to do, and I was invited to many colleges to talk to students about objective news reporting and headlines and things like that. And no, I wasn't paid to do that. And I'm starting to think, I'm not saying I'm holier than thou, but us oldies who stuck more rigidly to the rules and what have you need to go back and do that all over again. And when I do so, Joseph, please accompany me. We will do this together.
Date with Trisha, anytime.
Thank you. Love having you on the show. There we go. Joseph Kotrie-Monson with his take on the news headlines today. Back with more in just a moment.